so good to see so many wonderful faces here on tonight's call. I'm really excited that you all showed up. It's my pleasure to introduce Claudia. Claudia is an Indigenous culinary anthropologist and professor of ethnic studies. Our conversation tonight will explore Indigenous knowledge systems as a way to honor life while providing decolonial food for thought towards rethinking what it means to be in a relationship with food, land, and each other. Welcome, Claudia.
Thank you, Monica. It's a pleasure
It's
to be here.
It's so great to have you here. Some of the staff and students on tonight's call know that we actually had Claudia join us for one of our team learning meetups, and it was extraordinarily popular. We learned so much, and Claudia was actually the professor of one of our staff members, Megan. So we have always really appreciated Claudia and the influence that you've had at FFAC. I was hoping that we could begin our conversation tonight just thinking about something that you've said before on a podcast about how we are all on food journeys and that there are a multiplicity of ways to think about decolonial food work. And I just really love to hear about your journey.
Yes, for sure. So before I do share my personal food journey, I just want to acknowledge everybody here today, both in the present, and so in the physical and in the non-physical. I also want to just acknowledge space, place, and time, because that is constantly shifting and changing. I like to refer to this time and age as the decolonial age, where folks are becoming aware and awakened to their truths and towards creating more opportunities to fight and end systematic operations of oppression. And I also want to take this time to recognize, right, the global indigenous, and to open up an invitation for folks to become familiar, to begin to learn the histories of where they're located, the peoples and the stewards of that land, and also to begin to build relationships with the landscape. So the plants, non-humans, towards truly evoking what it means to be in relation and what it means to be in community, because community is not just human centered, right? It's human and non-human. It's all inclusive. It's eco cosmological, and so I just want to start there. And so, in returning to your question, Monica, so it's really interesting. When I talk about my food journey, I always talk about the time that I went to live in Northern California. And most recently, I've been able to really open up and share a little bit about my upbringing. And what's really fortunate for me is that because my parents, are from Mexico, and I have a very small family here in Turtle Island, present U.S. society, right? And what kept us grounded in who we are as people, as Purepecha, Huasteca, Zacatecan, was our food. And so I didn't know any better. I grew up eating what would be considered, as a whole a Mesoamerican diet, Mesoamerican foodways, which was local, it was ecological, it was sustainable, it was seasonal, it was organic, and a lot of it too was native. And it was really interesting because I always understood that my foodways were different from popular mainstream society, and that is because I was part of the educational system, right? So I got to experience it and see it, and actually I grew to be ashamed of it. And so there was a lot of shame in what I ate, and therefore there was a lot of shame in who I was, right? Because for me, food and who we are goes one in one. Like there's no separation. And so it wasn't until I finally hit a point where I want to say my ancestral memory was activated. There was this dire need to return to the land. And for me, the opportunity was to move to Northern California. And so while on this exploration of trying to find myself, I was guided back to the land. And I thought, well, of course I would be, right? Because the land is all knowing, the land is all powerful. And that energy brought me back, brought me to there. And while there, I was actually out at the Klamath territory. um, I was told to go gather food. And again, I was really I was scared because I didn't understand. Well, what do you mean by gather food? And I was told, oh, you see that hill over there, right? There's, berries, and there's these greens, and there's abundance. And kid you not, in that process of harvesting and gathering, I remember doing that as a child. I remember being with my grandmother, and I remember her saying, we got to pull this, we got to eat this, this is edible. And I would, I was young, so I was, okay, it's edible, like that's what it is. And it was interesting because in doing this early harvesting in my lifetime, when I was living in Northern California, there was a sense of like anger and this sense of relief and this sense of joy, because I felt like I was returning to something that was taken from me, right? And so that particular food experience really helped me delve deep into understanding, well, what food, truly defines who I am. What food is culturally relevant food, and why is it that my body is feeling this sensation that I really can't understand. And so that particular experience brought me into going deep and understanding what was it that my grandparents and great grandparents ate. Where did they eat it from? Where did they gather from? Where did the food come from? Right? I began to ask these really deep and heavy, profound questions. And in doing so, right, I was also an academic. I was a young graduate student. And I remember sitting there thinking about imperialism. I began thinking about colonialism, patriarchy, sexism. And I was asking questions as to, well, how is it that I'm continuing to experience this? Like, why am I still oppressed in these ways? And how am I oppressed? And I came across some Chicana feminist readings that talked about how we need to liberate our bodies from these particular types of systems. And at that moment, it clicked to me, well, the only way I can truly liberate myself is to liberate my taste buds, because I'm craving my oppressor's food ways. And those food ways is what's not healthy, right? It's not what's healthy in terms of my mind, body, spirit. And also too, it has created this particular disconnection from the land that I knew it was important to my well-being. And so at that moment, particular moment, I realized that part of me returning to my childhood cultural heritage cuisines was part of my decolonizing work. And immediately after I began to cook publicly for my community, I began to take recipes that I, was told were quote unquote Mexican food ways, and began to find the foods that were introduced as a result of colonialism and pull them out. So in essence, I began to decolonize my food ways. I began to decolonize, more so re-indigenize what has always been indigenous. But I want to say, appropriate it with other foods that weren't culturally relevant and didn't speak to the type of energetic alignment that I was looking for. And so from then on, I've just been, very active. I've met some beautiful and wonderful people all throughout Turtle Island, Mexico, South America, and many of us are native chefs. And we all understood what was happening. It was almost like this alignment. And I was told by one of our chef elders that it wasn't a coincidence that we all came together in our food work. It was because the food chose us. And so it's something that I uphold and truly believe because of the wonderful community that I've been able to cultivate and build with, in terms of creating a movement towards food sovereignty, food justice, and decolonization.
Claudia, this is such an interesting story. And to go a little bit to the beginning, I know I've heard you speak about how when you were growing up, you were eating the Three Sisters, you were eating the corns, beans, and squash, and that I believe you said it felt like poor people food, and that there was like some degree of, this is my word, of shame. And I'm just relating this back to my experience growing up, also being a part of the educational system. And I remember feeling like some shame around like bringing seaweed to lunch, for example. I remember wishing for nothing more than a turkey sandwich like all the other kids had. And I think it's really interesting how we have had this ideas of, culture and what's normal, quote unquote, in our society, and the standard American diet is extremely pervasive. And in our work, I've been very fortunate to speak at a lot of different communities, many with immigrant students. And I've asked them, how many of you since moving to the United States have started to consume more animal products, really adapt to that standard American diet? And pretty much every single student always raises their hand. So it's interesting to me how we got to this point with the standard American diet and how it influences people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I mean, I myself used to used to do host a lot of community workshops with newly immigrant and arriving folks. And that was a conversation we would have. We would talk about the changes in diet. And with the changes in diet, we also came to realize some other disproportionate health realities. But at the same time, what was really interesting is that we saw that mostly prominent and dominant with the second generation or the younger generations, because what we have also learned is that there's this phenomenon that they're calling the Latino paradox, where they have found that a lot of indigenous and newly migrant and immigrant families are actually eating their native, traditional, culturally relevant foods at home, right? But because of the push to eat more of, and you call it a standard American diet, but what I have learned to understand is it's a heavily animalized and feminized diet, right? Because it's a way of showing your your patriotism, right, to a nation that has openly accepted you, quote unquote, right? So there's like this sense of wanting to be other than what one is, because of those ideas that eating a Three Sisters diet, eating a plant-based diet, is a poor people's food diet. Eating beans, eating cactus, right? Eating corn beans and squash, like and again, these ideas are rooted in deep colonial experiences and deep colonial thought. When the Spanish arrived in Mesoamerica, those were the ideologies that dominated what one was going to eat. There was a belief that those foods were, one, inferior foods, and for those people that ate those foods were carriers of inferior bodies. And so the colonial mentality was that if I eat these foods, I'm going to lose my superiority and I'm going to default and become indigenous. And there was a fear of that, and this is documented in numerous works, situated in anthropology. And it's interesting because we see how those ideas have continued to penetrate the food systems, have continued to push on a gendered diet. Like, since when was diet ever gendered, And then two, because of, the marketing and the food politics and these global systems that we have in place, really emphasize that and deter us from eating plants in our diet, right? That we should be eating processed foods, animalized foods, and those that do come from feminized bodies. And so it's really problematic, because that has changed how indigenous peoples eat. It has tampered with our memories, right? Many of us have lost those taste memories, and that, personally for me, and also as shared in conversation with other community members, is where that knowledge resides. It's where that memory of who we are exists. And if we lose those taste buds, then we lose who we are. And those taste buds alone is what directs us to the food. It's what reminds us as to, well, what are the foods that we should be eating? What are those foods that were tainted and taken away from us as part of that colonizing project?
Yes. And there's so many things that I want to touch on there. I
I
mean,
know.
so I've always felt like, from my family, from my communities, that it was beneficial to be eating meat, that it was rich people food, that it showed that there was success and there was that connection to patriotism, for sure. And then we're talking about how, some people are starting to eat more indigenous foods, but at the same time, and I think that what we're going to need to talk about is there are these holidays coming up. Thanksgiving is a holiday that a lot of people in this country celebrate. And there is this now cultural tradition for Americans around eating turkeys, and indigenous people who have immigrated to the United States all connect Thanksgiving for the most part to eating turkey. And I'm wondering if I know that you've thought about this, but if you can share a little bit more about how this has happened, and if there's any hope of sharing with people more about the history of our foods, especially around this holiday season.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to me and the first thing that I think about is that a lot of these particular dominant holidays that have been created and have become institutionalized are really contributors, and they continue to enact what we know as historical amnesia. So it's almost creating like this false memory, this false narrative, right? So and then while at the same time creating indigenous erasure, right? So I mean, even like with Christopher Columbus Day, like, there's just been this whole push, and we're finally now within the age of decolonization, folks are like reclaiming that, right? And saying, no, it's, let's reclaim it towards Indigenous Peoples Day to really honor those folks and the true narratives of what it is that we're not learning in school, right? So like, and I could take this back to, again, myself learning about this. I didn't grow, Thanksgiving is, again, this idea that there was peace, this idea that there was violence, that there wasn't violence, this idea that, right, with the arrival of European settlers, that indigenous communities were all warm and welcoming, that was the intention. And again, this is the imagery that's being put into the mindset of the youth, right? But with that, again, it's also fulfilling this idea of the savage slot. Like, okay, well, it also creates this idea that Native peoples are no longer exist, that this was something of the past. And two, again, it's just such an illusion, because this is not what that narrative is. This is not what that story is, right? There was violence, there was aggression. The folks that needed help received it of the the Europeans that were suffering, were hungry, they were fed, and they were given an opportunity to find quote unquote salvation. But yet what happened is that those particular peoples, as the stories have been told, turned their back on the indigenous communities that brought them in, housed them, gave them food. In turn, they killed them. In turn, they took from them. And there's just been this strong push and desire to confuse folks, confuse the generations, that that this event actually took place. This idea of giving thanks, where indigenous peoples gave thanks for the arrival of Europeans, and Europeans gave thanks for indigenous peoples, like that just didn't happen. It didn't happen in that context. It didn't happen within, that particular narrative. And two, what we have to understand is that as a result of capitalism, right, holidays are necessary to, build up profit margins. And so we need this here in the US, right, quote unquote, to create this idea of coming together. The seasons is being utilized in here. It's a day of warmth. Family comes together. We and then we add a religious component to that, right? To give thanks to Creator and to God. And I'm not here to say don't give thanks. I'm not here to say count your blessings, right? What I'm here to say is that this is all part of the marketing economy that just has been able to build momentum to the point of where we see the types of atrocities that we see today, for the turkey relatives even, right? Like, they don't deserve that. I mean, we're talking millions of turkeys whose lives are being taken as a result of this false historical experience that has been turned into a holiday.
Yes, there is so much historical amnesia. I saw a lot of people nodding, and recognizing that this is associated with so much pain. So, but this season does mean a lot to many people at this point. There are traditions, cultures. I know that there are folks on this call that have been asking about how they should approach participation in these holidays without reinforcing dominant narratives, if there is a way to celebrate life when Thanksgiving in particular is, there's the taking away of the lives of the turkeys. Do you have any thoughts on that?
One thing I've had this conversation before, and I always think about, it's important for us to unpack, right, what we mean by life taking. Um, and because again, like there's always this, it's so interesting how this works. We're either thinking about humans or we're not, or we're thinking about non-human animals and that's it. But here I'm like, when we're talking about life taking, like I think it's important to not create erasure for anyone or anything, right? Um, so not only are we life taking from, like the turkeys, for example, but we're taking from the land, we're taking from the water, we're taking from native peoples, right? And then two, we have the workers, we have the laborers, right, that are doing this work. This is like life taking. We're taking spirit, we're taking energy. And it's just constant, take, even to the point of death, right? And so how do we continue to um move forward, right? And so what I always say, and this is something that has been passed down to me from my elders, is that we need to, and no matter what, we still need to give thanks for the life that we have. We still need to give thanks to the water because it's still here with us. We need to give thanks to the land because despite the colonial environmental atrocity that it has experienced, it's still here with us, right? We also need to give thanks to the air. Despite, right, the climate change and the climate crisis that we're experiencing, we could still breathe, right? And then two, fire. We don't have fire, we can't cook, right? And so I have learned that it's still important to give thanks and also too for conviviality. And what I like to talk about is the food, especially those native foods, because if folks really pay attention to what it is that they bring in their home, you'll see, I mean, we're talking about native foods that are entering our home, right? And so I personally give thanks for those foods because one, they have survived not just genocide, not just ethnocide, ecocide, and nutricide, right? These were all colonial attempts to get rid of these foods, yet they survived. They have managed to overcome and whether it's through seed saving, whether it's through just the taste bud memory. And so, what I do is I just always tend to remember that one, I'm not alone in this journey, and two, that food is my teacher. And so I give thanks for the teachings that the food arrives with when it enters my home, because that food alone, it doesn't come just as food by itself. It comes with the ancestral and the traditional knowledge, the ethnobotanical understandings of when to seed, when to plant, when to harvest, when to forage, what phase of the moon needs to be in when we engage in these ceremonies. And then two, right, the fact that we still celebrate the commons where we gather, and that's really important in understanding, for those that participate in what some of us call thanks taking, is that there's still life to celebrate. And what's important is for us to work through that historical amnesia and work through no longer creating indigenous erasure so that we can truly celebrate something that's moving us more towards a decolonizing Thanksgiving.
Yeah, and I see that one of the folks in the chat, they're again really excited about the three sisters. I appreciate the exclamation mark. And I've heard you talk about approaching your way of eating as indigenous and plant-based and re-indigenizing your diet. I think that what's really interesting to me is that when I speak to folks about culture and eating, many people try to make arguments that Native people eat so many animal products and that is actually a big part of culture and that is what should be promoted or shared a lot more. And I find it interesting that you don't take that approach. And I'm also wondering if you can speak a little bit more about your thoughts on the word vegan, because I've heard you talk about how that it's situated in ideologies of white racial purity. So just understanding the contrast between veganism and the indigenous principles in which you approach eating.
Sure. I do want to start though with your first comment about Native peoples, and their foodways. And I've come across this several times now myself, where there's this huge argument again, where it's like, well, Native peoples always ate, meat and always ate this, and again, I like to meet people where they're at. Like it's just everything for me. There's transition, there's movement. That's just how the world moves. If we look at ecology alone, right, it's cyclical, there's a cycle. And what folks don't understand, and I try to emphasize this too when I talk to some folks, one, the indigenous historical foodways and ways of eating is very different. It's very situational, depending on, again, time, place, space, geography. However, and I will make this argument over and over again, right? There is seasonality that is like just one of those strongest like food principles that exists with all of Native America, right? Where there's some foods that you just do not eat because they're not in season. And what I have learned, particularly for like the Pacific Northwest, all the way down to the Southwest, along the West Coast, right, is that there's a time to hunt, there's a time to gather, there's a time to dry, there's a time, right? And there's also a time to cleanse. And so for those Native communities that did consume flesh and other non-plant foods throughout the year, right? It wasn't all the time, right? During winter, you're consuming the foods that you have dried, which a lot of it is root food. And then you have the spring, you're eating your greens, you're eating the plants that are cleansing your body. During the summer, you're eating the berries, right? You're not eating bison and in the springtime. I mean, that's mate season, so there's a time and place for everything. And so I like to say that for some indigenous communities, there was seasons of when you would only eat plants. Now, in Mesoamerican society, which is where my peoples are from, the diet was a little different. There, it was 80% dominantly plant-based, with corn being involved in almost every element. And so, we have to understand, again, that it's very situational. But in any case, right, there was never one group that was heavily animal based as the diets are of today. And so, but in returning then to the question about, veganism and so forth, well, one thing that I have understood in my work is that, again, there was this idea that if you consume plant-based foods, returning to the three sisters, right, you're going to lose your superiority, you're going to become native, which is, a bad thing, right, because those were the ideas of the colonizers. And, throughout time, right, food began to become, change. And we begin to see a lot more European foodways, European cravings, European ingredients appropriate a lot of native foods, like the tamal, for example. There was no lard, there was no chicken, beef, or pork, any of that, because those are not foods of the Americas, right? A lot of the tamales, over hundreds of them, mind you, were plant-based. People are like, oh, there had to have been meat. Very little, to be very honest, because that wasn't the dominant food of the people producing the tamales during the times that they were being produced. And so in any case, right, it's important to understand that in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, there was this quest and the desire to be pure. It came with this Puritan ideology of the body, and to have a pure body meant to have a godlike body. And so a society was formed. It was called, it was like a sanctuarium where folks can come to cleanse their bodies, right? But these bodies were white bodies. And the foods that were being fed to them were foods that were local, ecological, sustainable, seasonal, organic, and native. They were foods of that particular landscape. But yet there was no mention or hint towards that those foods were indigenous foods or indigenous foodways. And I like to use that as an acronym, which is LESSON, because that's what it speaks to what food is. And again, so this idea was that you have to eat this pure way of eating. At first, it was, called vegetarianism, but then folks began to debate, and then, even the Kellogg's were involved in this, right? They began to really push the idea of eating grains. And eventually, we're a group detoured from that and coined this term vegan, which was really to uphold the white body, which is situated in white supremacist ideology, right? And so when I think about, veganism, I understand that it's the term itself is rooted in these white supremacist ideologies of the body, because yet it wasn't inclusive of indigenous, black, and POC folks. It was that there was a separation, and there had to be pure bodies, and then there was impure bodies. Now, throughout time, of course, that has evolved. People have taken those meanings to mean something different, and now we have arrived to where it means, you no longer eat animal-based flesh, animal-based products. And then also too, right, we're talking about the land, we're talking about the environment, we're talking about being in ecology, being in relation. And when I began to study that and study those meanings, I was like, a lot of what I know of the people that have claimed veganism for their own, within their own terms, those ideologies that are pushing them towards being vegan are really native principles. And I began to see the connection. And so what I began to do, and what I began to advocate in my community, is that, well, aside from decolonizing our veganism, right? So getting away from the processed foods that define vegan foodways today, let's go another level and let's begin to indigenize our veganism. So let's begin to bring back those indigenous foods that are situated in the geographies that we find ourselves in, to really speak towards a type of revivance and survivance and celebration of what those indigenous plant-based foods are. And so within my work, that's something that I began to really put together, is understanding that we can decolonize our veganism, right? So let's get away from those byproducts and what some folks even call the edible food like substances, and bring real food into the picture. And so with that, and in understanding what, and that we can practice a type of indigenous veganism, is the understanding of those principles behind that, right? So for me, for example, when I first began to really put this into practice, folks were like, "Oh, well, are you concerned about the animals? Are you concerned about the brutality and and so forth?" This was years ago, and I was like, "Yeah, I am, but I'm more concerned about the displacement and the environmental racism that the bear and the coyote and the salmon are experiencing, because they're being pushed off their land, right?" So I saw that my foodways was in solidarity to what was happening to these other non-human nations. And so then I began to kind of put that together and rethinking, well, what does it mean to be vegan? What does it mean to be plant-based? And so now, because I do not pretend that vegetarianism and veganism are not rooted in those white supremacist ideologies of the body, I'm more comfortable talking about indigenous plant-based, or just simply indigenous foodways, because those speak to a principle that is situated in both what vegan and vegetarians understand today, in terms of what makes them want to be that, or within their ideological practices, not just because it's a trend, but also because it holds me accountable. And I like to be true to my relations and to what it means to decolonize. And so I'm going to do whatever it takes to make that happen, because I know that without upholding those indigenous memories that are upheld in the food, again, we lose our sense of self. And to lose our sense of self means that the colonizing project wins. And I'm a fighter, and I'm not going to allow that to happen.